If you had known me years ago, you probably would not have liked to have been with me years ago. I was angry and frustrated. I felt isolated, as I've shared, because of the way that I had been brought up. I didn't know how to communicate. It had always been one directional, and I was shut up. So whenever I did have a chance to share, there was a lot of energy and anger behind it, right? And that still comes out sometimes when I'm frustrated, like at the Apple store, right? So, but I catch myself, but back then that was the rule. Like I was always that way. Now that is so seldom. So I'm here to tell you that you can transform anything. If I could change what I changed, I promise you, the smaller things you have that you want to maybe change, it's definitely doable. All right, and I'd like to share a little bit about my history because it not only exemplifies the role that communication plays in our lives, but also will explain why it is that I'm doing this work. So my father had been a military man. He was a colonel in the Air Force, and he had gone to West Point. He was at the Pentagon as an engineer. He worked at the Air Force Academy as a professor, and he was also a pilot in Vietnam. And his job in Vietnam was to fly cargo planes, and he would fly into combat zones, pick up wounded soldiers, parts of wounded soldiers, and fly them back out again to safety zone. He was shot down, his co-pilot was killed, but he did come back from the war. And at that time, in the 1960s, they did not know PTSD. They didn't have it defined. That didn't mean that the people didn't go through it. They were very, very traumatized. And coming back to this country at that point in time, they were not heralded as heroes as they are today. They actually were marked really more as murderers. And it was a difficult time for everybody involved. And what my father was unable to digest, and what he did not receive help with from the military to digest in his life, actually festered in our home. And I grew up with a lot of violence, physical and verbal, and it was not an easy thing to do. I was also told that children are to be seen and not heard. Did anybody ever hear that when you were a child, right? It's almost like you just didn't exist because you were short and young, right? So I learned very early what was permitted in communication, what I was allowed to share or not share, and how I was supposed to say it. There were a lot of rules, and we all grow up in them. Even if we grow up in a very comfortable, pleasant environment, we still have rules about how we're supposed to communicate with ourselves and with other people. So now I'd like to share with you an experience I had when I was younger, which is probably the biggest reason that I'm sharing this information with you tonight. I was probably around 12 years old, and I remember listening to my parents. I heard my parents arguing, and that was not unusual in our home. And I came up the stairs to see what was going on, and I had a very bizarre experience, and maybe you can relate to it. If you have, sometimes on your computer, you have a number of different screens open, and one of them may have a video playing or music playing, but it's not the one you're looking at. So you're looking at one, and you think that's what's going on, and then in the background you have something totally different happening. Have you ever had that happen? Yeah? It's confusing, because you're not, and then you try and click around, it's like, what's happening here? They're not aligned. They're not in sync. And so when I came upstairs and I listened to them arguing, and the intensity and really the verbal violence, if you will, the accusations and the anger, I remember feeling so distinctly something else was going on. That wasn't what was happening. It was like those two different films happening. So I asked myself in that situation, what was it? What was going on? And what I felt actually was that both of them had something going on emotionally, but that's not what was being expressed. That's not what was being shared. They weren't in touch with themselves, and if they had been, the question is would they have actually shared that with the other person? And I remember having the thought, that has to be possible. If it's possible to actually feel what's going on in yourself and be clear in yourself, it also has to be possible to share that with another person. And when you do that, you have the highest chances actually of having communication and connecting with someone. So when I had that thought, and this was many years ago, I'm not going to tell you how many, but it was many, it stayed with me. And I thought, that's got to be possible. So here I am all these years later, and I figured out actually that it is possible. Not easy, but so fruitful and possible. And that's what I want to share with you tonight. You remember the two films, right? So that was inauthentic. If they had been clear in themselves and had been able to actually share what was going on for them emotionally, what was below the anger and the judgment and the frustration, the loud voices, to feel that within themselves and then to share authentically with one another, that situation and many others would have gone very differently. In life, I was at a party in college, and I was having a conversation with a young man. I was young too at the time, and he was rather nice looking, which I thought was kind of cool. And so we're having this conversation, and I'm thinking we're getting somewhere. And he looked at me and he said, "You are so hard, somebody could walk on you with cleats on and you wouldn't feel it." I was absolutely speechless. I was like, oh my God, are you serious? Because what was happening inside of me was obviously completely different than what I was sharing on the outside. That was the discrepancy between the two, right? And so that's the reason I've done this work, is because I've wanted to bring that into alignment. So before we close, I'd like to share a story with you that I would say it did change my life, and it kind of culminated my life in many ways. When I would come home from Europe, I spent most of my life in Europe, and I'd come back to the United States in the summers. My father, same gentleman I spoke about, who was a good person, but he was challenged for a lot of reasons, as I've shared. He would spend time with me, and what he would say is we would go out for one meal during my trip, right? And I'd come when the children had summer break. And that was our quality time. That was his idea of quality time. We'd have one meal during that whole period of time. So this one morning, we go to the Broadmoor Hotel, and we're sitting on the patio and having a cup of coffee, and it was just like the normal thing. And he looks at me, surprises me, and he looks at me and he said, "You never talk to me anymore. You don't tell me your thoughts. You don't share with me." So I'm listening to him, and I'm thinking, yeah, that's pretty accurate. There are a lot of reasons for that, right? And he said, "So I want to hear your thoughts. Why don't you just share with me? I want to hear what's going on in your life." And I thought, two things. First of all, he's making an attempt. Like, he's reaching out. He's wanting to connect. We've been talking about connection. But I just had a lot of fear. There was a lot of stuff going on. So I said to him directly, I said, "You know, Dad, there's a reason that I don't share with you." I said, "Most of my life you've told me I don't know what I'm talking about. So that's kind of hindered me. And the other thing you've told me is I'll figure it out when I grow up." And I kind of am. Grown up now. I was in my 40s, and I still don't feel like my opinion is heard. So there's not been a lot of reason for me to share. And I said it as kindly and as nicely as I possibly could. Still a little bit nervous about the response. And he said to me, all right, you're right. He said, "I tell you what we're going to do. You tell me your opinion of the current administration, and I'm going to listen." So he was in the military. He was very politically involved, and we were at totally different ends of the political spectrum. And he wanted me to give him his opinion, my opinion, of the administration at the time, one that I had not personally voted for. And again, I thought, that's probably not going to go very well, right? I could really do as best job as I can, but I still don't think it's going to go very well. So I said to him, "I tell you what I'll do," still acknowledging that he really wanted to connect with me. And I wanted to honor that, because he had never done this in all of my life, reached out that way. So I said, "I tell you what I'll do, Dad. I said, I'm going to tell you how I see the world, and then you'll know a lot more about me." And so I did. And I shared with him a lot of these things that I believe in good, that I want the best for people, that I believe that I don't believe in evil, but I believe that what we call evil and what can be measured as evil is how far someone is from their own experience of their own goodness. And the farther away that they get from that, the more things they do that can be called evil and horrendous in our world. And when I finished explaining all this to him, he was quiet for a moment. And then he looked at me and he said something that I never would have believed. And it changed my experience of him and our relationship. He said, "I wish I had the courage to see the world the way you do." And that blew me away. Absolutely blew me away. And we stood up from that table and we walked all the way around this lake, holding hands for the first time in 40 years. It was profound. So I share that with you because absolutely communication can transform situations. And if that situation could change, and the years that followed that, I believe from that conversation my father began to forgive himself for whatever it was he felt he needed to forgive. He found his heart. I was with him up until the day he died. It was an absolutely the most important relationship of my entire life. And when I started out in this lifetime, I never thought that that's where we would have ended. So this situation is absolutely possible. And I'm personal proof of it. And I can tell you communication and coming from that place of your heart and connection is the absolute way that can get you there.